He was a prisoner. He was a warrior. But what happened when her voice touched his blind son's heart? You won't believe what the Comanche warrior did next. Thank you so much for watching, and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The Texas plains stretched endless under the crimson sky of 1867, where the last rays of sunlight painted the grasslands in shades of copper and gold. 23-year-old Rebecca Morrison had been traveling with a small wagon train from Missouri to San Antonio when the Comanche war party struck 3 days prior. The attack had been swift and brutal, leaving the caravan in flames and most of its occupants dead or scattered across the prairie. Rebecca, along with 2 other women, had been taken captive, bound, and forced to march for days under the merciless sun. Now, as the evening settled over the temporary Comanche camp near the Brazos River, Rebecca sat with her wrists tied, her long auburn hair matted with dust, her pale blue dress torn and stained. Her captors spoke in a language she couldn't understand, their voices carrying across the campfires that dotted the encampment. She observed everything with careful eyes, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, though she knew the futility of such plans in this vast, unfamiliar wilderness. Rebecca had been a schoolteacher back in Independence, Missouri, known for her gentle voice and her love of music. Even now, in captivity, she found herself unconsciously humming melodies her mother had taught her as a child, songs that brought comfort in the darkest moments. It was this very habit that would soon change the course of her life in ways she could never have imagined. Across the camp, near the largest fire, stood Running Eagle, a Comanche warrior of 30 years whose presence commanded immediate respect. His broad shoulders and muscular frame spoke of countless battles and hunts, his dark eyes reflecting both fierce intelligence and deep sorrow. His face, handsome and strong with high cheekbones and a proud jawline, bore the marks of a leader among his people. Running Eagle was known throughout the Comanche bands as both a formidable warrior and a devoted father, though tragedy had shadowed his recent years. 2 winters ago, his wife, Morning Star, had died during a raid by Texas Rangers, leaving him alone to care for their son. The boy, Little Hawk, had been born with sight, but a fever that swept through the camp when he was 4 years old had stolen his vision, leaving him blind. Now 6 years old, Little Hawk relied entirely on his father and the other members of their band for survival. Running Eagle had become even more protective, more isolated, carrying the weight of his losses like stones in his heart. As darkness fell completely, Running Eagle sat with his son near their fire, the boy nestled against his side. Little Hawk's small hands reached out, touching his father's face, reading the tension there with practiced fingers. The child was remarkably perceptive despite his blindness, able to sense emotions and changes in his environment that others might miss. Rebecca watched this tender scene from her position across the camp, her heart aching at the sight of the father and son. Despite her fear and her precarious situation, she recognized love when she saw it. The warrior's gentle handling of the blind child stood in stark contrast to the fierce fighter who had helped capture the wagon train. This contradiction puzzled her, made her see these people as more than the savage raiders she had been taught to fear. The night grew colder, and Rebecca shivered in her thin dress. One of the older Comanche women, her face creased with years of sun and wind, threw a buffalo hide blanket toward her without a word. Rebecca wrapped it around her shoulders, nodding her thanks, though the woman had already turned away. She understood that compassion and cruelty could exist side by side, that survival demanded hardness, while humanity demanded kindness. Unable to sleep, Rebecca began to sing softly, almost unconsciously. The melody was an old Irish lullaby her mother had sung, the words flowing in a language even older than English. Her voice, clear and sweet despite days without water, carried across the quiet camp like a spirit on the wind. She sang of green hills and gentle rain, of mothers rocking babies to sleep, of peace and safety and home. The effect was immediate and unexpected. Little Hawk's head lifted, turning toward the sound with sudden alertness. His small face, beautiful despite the clouded eyes that could not see, lit with wonder. He pulled at his father's arm, speaking rapidly in Comanche, his voice excited and curious. Running Eagle's expression darkened as he realized his son was reacting to the white captive's singing. Rebecca fell silent as she noticed the warrior's attention fixed on her. Even across the distance between their fires, she could feel the intensity of his gaze, could sense both his anger and something else, something more complex. She lowered her eyes, fear returning in full force. She had heard terrible stories of what happened to captives who drew too much attention to themselves. But Little Hawk would not be quieted. The boy spoke insistently to his father, tugging at his arm, his face turned expectantly toward where Rebecca sat. Running Eagle listened to his son, his jaw tight, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his desire to give the child anything that brought him joy. Finally, with visible reluctance, he stood, lifting Little Hawk in his strong arms and carrying him across the camp toward the white woman. Rebecca's heart hammered as the warrior approached. Up close, he was even more imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall, his body a testament to years of hard living and fighting. But it was his eyes that held her attention, dark and deep, filled with a grief and intelligence that transcended language barriers. He spoke to her in Comanche, his voice deep and commanding, though she understood nothing of the words. When she shook her head helplessly, indicating she didn't understand, frustration flickered across his features. He gestured to his son, then to her, making a motion near his mouth. The meaning became clear. He wanted her to sing for the boy. Rebecca hesitated, wondering if this was some kind of test, if refusing would mean punishment. But looking at Little Hawk's eager, upturned face, she found she couldn't deny the child. She began to sing again, choosing another lullaby, this one in English, but with a melody so universal it seemed to transcend words. Little Hawk's face transformed with delight, a smile spreading across his features that made him look even younger than his 6 years. He reached out his hands toward the sound, and Rebecca, moved by impulse, extended her own bound hands to let the child touch them. Little Hawk's fingers explored her hands gently, feeling the smoothness of her skin, so different from the calloused hands of the Comanche women. He spoke to his father, his voice full of questions. Running Eagle watched this interaction with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and reluctant gratitude. When the song ended, Little Hawk immediately asked for more, his words unintelligible to Rebecca, but his meaning clear. She sang 3 more songs before Running Eagle finally pulled his son away, the boy protesting even as his father carried him back to their fire. But something had shifted in that brief encounter. Some invisible thread had been woven between the captive white woman, the blind Comanche boy, and the grieving warrior father. Rebecca felt it, strange and undeniable, as she watched them disappear into the shadows beyond the firelight. That night, as she lay on the hard ground wrapped in the buffalo hide, Rebecca stared up at the vast expanse of stars overhead and wondered what the morning would bring. She thought of her own family, her parents and younger brother back in Missouri, who would never know what became of her. She thought of the life she had planned, teaching school in San Antonio, perhaps finding a husband, building a future in Texas. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, like a dream that belonged to someone else. Yet despite her fear and uncertainty, she couldn't stop thinking about the warrior's face when he had brought his son to hear her sing, the way his hard expression had softened almost imperceptibly as he watched Little Hawk's joy. There was humanity there, depth and feeling that challenged everything she had been taught about the Comanche people. The morning sun rose harsh and unforgiving over the Comanche camp, bringing with it a day that would test Rebecca's courage in ways she had never anticipated. She was awakened roughly by one of the warriors, her bindings cut from her wrists only to be replaced with a length of rawhide that tied her to a post near the women's work area. The other 2 captive women were similarly bound, and together they were put to work scraping buffalo hides, a task that left their hands raw and bleeding within the first hour. Rebecca worked in silence, her mind focused on survival, on not drawing attention to herself. She watched the Comanche women trying to learn from their efficient movements, their practiced hands. Some of the women ignored the captives entirely, while others shot them looks of pure hatred, reminders that these white women represented an enemy that had killed their own people, destroyed their way of life with advancing settlements and broken treaties. It was nearly midday when Little Hawk appeared, led by an elderly woman who Rebecca would later learn was called Gray Dove, the boy's grandmother and Running Eagle's mother. The child moved with surprising confidence despite his blindness, one hand on Grey Dove's arm, his feet finding the uneven ground with practiced care. He was searching for something, his head turning this way and that, and when Grey Dove brought him near enough to hear Rebecca's breathing, his face lit with recognition. He spoke rapidly to his grandmother, pointing toward Rebecca with unerring accuracy. Grey Dove's response was sharp, clearly dismissive, but Little Hawk persisted with the stubborn determination of a child who knows what he wants. The old woman finally relented with obvious reluctance, leading the boy closer to where Rebecca knelt working on the buffalo hide. Little Hawk sat down near Rebecca, speaking to her in Comanche, his voice friendly and excited. When she responded softly in English, explaining that she couldn't understand him, he seemed unbothered by the language barrier. Instead, he began to hum, trying to recreate the melodies she had sung the night before, his small voice earnest and slightly off-key. Rebecca's heart melted at the sound, and without thinking of the consequences, she began to sing quietly, continuing her work as her voice wove the lullaby through the afternoon air. The effect on the camp was immediate. Several of the Comanche women stopped their work to listen, their expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. Grey Dove stood with her arms crossed, watching this interaction with a frown that couldn't quite hide her surprise at seeing her grandson so happy, so engaged with another person. The old woman had watched Little Hawk withdraw into himself after losing his sight, had seen his world shrink to the small circle he could navigate by touch and sound. This white woman's singing had awakened something in the boy that had been dormant for too long. Running Eagle emerged from his lodge as the sun reached its zenith, his attention immediately drawn to the sound of singing and his son's delighted laughter. He approached with long, purposeful strides, his expression thunderous. He spoke harshly to his mother, gesturing at Rebecca and Little Hawk, clearly demanding to know why the captive was being allowed to interact with his son. Grey Dove responded with equal force, her aged voice sharp with authority that even her warrior son could not completely dismiss. Their argument drew the attention of others in the camp, including several senior warriors and the band's chief, Stone Shield, a man in his 50s whose weathered face spoke of wisdom earned through decades of leadership. Stone Shield observed the scene with calculating eyes, noting Little Hawk's unprecedented animation, the way the blind boy responded to Rebecca's presence. The chief approached Running Eagle, speaking in measured tones that gradually seemed to calm the younger warrior's anger. Rebecca continued to sing, though her voice trembled slightly with nervousness. She could sense the tension in the air, could feel multiple gazes upon her, judging, evaluating. Little Hawk reached out and found her hand, holding it gently as she sang, his small fingers wrapped around hers with complete trust. The simple gesture spoke louder than any words could, and even Running Eagle seemed affected by it, his expression shifting from anger to something more conflicted. Stone Shield made a decision, speaking with the authority of his position. Rebecca didn't understand the words, but she understood the result when her binding was removed from the post, when she was led to a different area of the camp, closer to Running Eagle's lodge. Grey Dove took charge of her, the old woman's face stern but not entirely unkind, and Rebecca realized with a mixture of relief and apprehension that her status had somehow changed. She was still a captive, but she had been placed under the protection of Running Eagle's family, assigned to help care for Little Hawk. The days that followed established a new routine. Rebecca was given slightly better clothing, a simple deerskin dress that the Comanche women wore, and her hands were treated with a healing salve that Grey Dove prepared from prairie plants. She was taught basic words in Comanche, learned to say water, food, yes, no, thank you. Little Hawk became her constant companion, the boy following the sound of her voice, asking her to sing again and again, finding comfort and joy in her presence. Running Eagle maintained a careful distance, watching these developments with an expression that Rebecca could not quite interpret. She caught him observing her, as she worked alongside his mother, as she sang to his son, as she learned to move through the camp with growing confidence. Sometimes his gaze held suspicion, other times something softer, almost like gratitude. He rarely spoke directly to her, but his presence was a constant awareness, like the sun overhead or the wind across the plains. Rebecca found herself studying him in return, noticing details she had missed in her initial fear. The way he moved with unconscious grace despite his size, the gentle patience he showed with Little Hawk, the respect other warriors showed him. She saw him return from hunts with deer and buffalo, watched him work on weapons and equipment with skilled hands, observed him in council with other warriors and the chief. He was a man of contradictions, capable of great violence but also great tenderness, a protector and provider who carried his responsibilities with visible weight. 2 weeks into her captivity, Rebecca's understanding of Comanche had improved enough for basic communication. She learned that Running Eagle's name in his own language was Wapiti Pia, that Little Hawk was called Tihui, and that Gray Dove's name translated to Koku Hoop. She learned that the band was preparing to move to their winter camp in the Palo Duro Canyon, that the buffalo hunts would intensify as the weather grew colder, that her presence had caused significant discussion among the tribal council. One evening, as Rebecca sat with Little Hawk by the fire, teaching him English words while he taught her Comanche, Running Eagle approached and sat down across from them. It was the first time he had voluntarily joined them, and Rebecca felt her pulse quicken with nervousness. Little Hawk immediately began chattering to his father, excited to show off the new words he had learned, and Running Eagle listened with an expression that gradually softened as he watched his son's enthusiasm. Then, surprising Rebecca completely, Running Eagle spoke to her directly in halting English, words he had clearly learned from traders or captives in the past. His accent was thick, his grammar imperfect, but the effort he was making was unmistakable. He asked her name, where she came from, why she sang. Rebecca answered slowly, carefully, sharing pieces of her story, watching his face as he processed her words. She told him about her family, about her love of music, about her journey to Texas that had ended in capture. Running Eagle listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking again, this time in Comanche, which Little Hawk eagerly translated into the English words Rebecca had taught him. Running Eagle was telling her about Morning Star, about Little Hawk's mother, about the raid that had taken her life and left their son without the woman who had loved him most in the world. The pain in his voice transcended language, and Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes at the raw grief she heard there. Little Hawk, sensing the emotional weight of the conversation, reached out to both his father and Rebecca, his small hands bridging the space between them. The three of them sat there in the firelight, connected by loss and loneliness, by the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Rebecca realized with startling clarity that she no longer felt like a captive in that moment, but rather like someone who had stumbled into a family that needed her as much as she had come to need them. The night deepened around them, and other members of the camp began to settle into their lodges for sleep. Running Eagle stood, preparing to carry Little Hawk to bed, but the boy protested, asking Rebecca to sing one more song. She obliged, her voice rising into the darkness with a melody about stars and dreams, and finding home in unexpected places. Running Eagle stood perfectly still, listening, his son drowsy in his arms, and when the song ended, he spoke 2 words in English that Rebecca would remember for the rest of her life. Thank you. The weeks turned into months as autumn painted the Texas plains in golds and russets, and Rebecca's life transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The band had moved to their winter camp in Palo Duro Canyon, a hidden sanctuary of towering red cliffs and sheltered valleys, where the Comanche had wintered for generations. Here, protected from the harsh prairie winds, Rebecca found herself becoming part of the rhythm of Comanche life, no longer a captive, but something far more complex. Her relationship with Little Hawk had deepened into genuine affection. The boy followed her everywhere his father would allow, learning English songs and teaching her Comanche stories, his blindness no barrier to the bond they shared. Rebecca marveled at his resilience, his joy despite the darkness he lived in, and she found purpose in caring for him, teaching him, helping him navigate a world he could not see but could understand in ways that transcended sight. But it was her evolving connection with Running Eagle that occupied her thoughts during the quiet moments, that made her heart beat faster when she heard his voice or felt his presence nearby. The warrior had begun to seek her out more frequently, sitting with her and Little Hawk in the evenings, attempting longer conversations in his broken English while she practiced her improving Comanche. She learned about his life, his battles, his dreams for his son's future in a world that was changing too rapidly for his people to adapt. Running Eagle, in turn, found himself drawn to Rebecca in ways that both confused and frightened him. She represented everything he had been taught to mistrust, the white settlers who pushed ever westward, taking Comanche land and destroying their way of life. Yet she also represented something he thought he had lost forever after Morning Star's death, the possibility of companionship, of shared burdens, of hope. He watched her gentle patience with Little Hawk, her willingness to learn their ways, her courage in facing a life so different from everything she had known, and he found his carefully maintained walls beginning to crumble. Gray Dove noticed these developments with the shrewd observation of a woman who had lived through many seasons and understood the human heart. She spoke to her son one evening after Little Hawk had fallen asleep, her words direct and uncompromising. She told Running Eagle that the white woman had brought light back into their lodge, that Little Hawk smiled again because of her, that sometimes enemies could become family if the heart was willing to see beyond old wounds. Running Eagle listened to his mother's wisdom, unable to deny the truth of her observations, yet still wrestling with loyalty to his people and the memory of his dead wife. The turning point came during a dangerous winter storm that swept down from the north with unexpected ferocity. The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, tearing at the lodges, driving snow and ice before it with blinding force. In the chaos, Little Hawk, frightened by the noise and confusion, had wandered from the lodge seeking Rebecca, whose voice he had learned to associate with safety and comfort. Rebecca, working with the other women to secure supplies against the storm, heard Gray Dove's frantic calls and understood immediately what had happened. Without hesitation, she plunged into the whiteout conditions, calling Little Hawk's name, following the small tracks in the rapidly filling snow. Running Eagle, returning from helping secure the horse herd, saw his mother's terror and understood instantly. He ran into the storm, his heart pounding with a fear more primal than any he had felt in battle. He found them together near the canyon wall, Rebecca huddled around Little Hawk, her body shielding his smaller form from the worst of the wind and cold, her voice singing to him despite chattering teeth, keeping him calm and warm with her presence. Running Eagle scooped them both up, Little Hawk in one arm and Rebecca supported by the other, and fought his way back through the storm to the lodge. His strength, honed by years of warrior training, never faltered even as the wind tried to knock them down, even as the cold bit through his clothing and numbed his extremities. Inside the lodge, warmed by the fire that Gray Dove had kept burning, Running Eagle worked frantically to warm his son, rubbing feeling back into the boy's cold hands and feet, wrapping him in buffalo robes. Little Hawk, once he understood he was safe, immediately asked for Rebecca, reaching out for her with desperate hands. Running Eagle turned to find the white woman collapsed near the entrance, her lips blue with cold, her body shaking uncontrollably from hypothermia and exhaustion. What happened next would be spoken of in the camp for years to come. Running Eagle lifted Rebecca with infinite care, bringing her to the fire, removing her wet clothing with hands that trembled not from cold but from emotion. Gray Dove helped him wrap Rebecca in warm furs, prepare hot broth to bring feeling back to her frozen body, apply healing herbs to the frostbite on her fingers and toes. Through it all, Running Eagle never left her side, his large hands gentle as he rubbed warmth back into her limbs, his voice speaking to her in Comanche, telling her to stay with them, to fight, to live. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness throughout that long night, aware of Running Eagle's presence like an anchor in the darkness, his strength flowing into her when her own threatened to fail. She heard Little Hawk crying, heard Gray Dove's soothing voice, but most of all she felt Running Eagle's hands on her, warming her, healing her, willing her to survive. When she finally opened her eyes fully as dawn broke, the first thing she saw was his face, exhausted and worried, watching over her with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat. In that moment, everything changed between them. Running Eagle reached out, touching her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with his warrior's hands, and spoke words in Comanche that Gray Dove quietly translated. He was thanking her for saving his son, for risking her life without hesitation, for loving Little Hawk as if he were her own child. But there was more in his eyes than gratitude, something deeper and more profound, and Rebecca felt answering emotions rising in her own heart, feelings she had been trying to deny for weeks. The days following the storm saw a shift in the camp's attitude toward Rebecca. The story of how she had risked everything to save Little Hawk spread quickly, and even those who had viewed her with suspicion or hostility began to see her differently. Stone Shield himself came to Running Eagle's lodge, speaking with the warrior for hours, and when he left, Running Eagle looked at Rebecca with an expression of mingled hope and uncertainty. That evening, Running Eagle asked Rebecca to walk with him, away from the lodge, to a quiet place overlooking the canyon where they could talk privately. Little Hawk, sensing something important was happening, encouraged them to go, his small face serious beyond his years. With Gray Dove's knowing smile following them, Rebecca and Running Eagle left the lodge together, walking side by side through the winter camp as the sun set in brilliant colors across the canyon walls. Running Eagle struggled to find the words, mixing Comanche and English, his normally confident demeanor replaced by an almost boyish nervousness. He told Rebecca that he had spoken with Stone Shield and the council, that he had received permission to make her a true member of the tribe if she wished it, to take her as his wife if she would have him. He spoke of his fears, his uncertainty about bridging two worlds that were at war, but also of his growing love for her, his admiration for her courage, his gratitude for the joy she had brought back into his son's life and his own. Rebecca listened with tears streaming down her face, her heart so full she could barely breathe. She thought of her old life, of Missouri and teaching school and the future she had planned, and realized that somewhere along this unexpected journey, she had found something far more precious. She had found a man who valued her strength as much as her gentleness, a child who needed her love, a people who had accepted her despite every reason not to, and a home in the most unlikely of places. She answered in Comanche, the words she had practiced with Gray Dove, telling Running Eagle that she loved him, that she loved Little Hawk, that she would be honored to become his wife and part of his people. Running Eagle pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest where she could feel the rapid beating of his heart. And in that embrace, Rebecca felt all the broken pieces of her life rearranging into a pattern more beautiful than anything she could have designed herself. The wedding ceremony took place under the full moon 2 weeks later, a blend of Comanche tradition and the vows Rebecca wished to exchange. She wore a deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork that Gray Dove and the other women had created for her, her auburn hair braided with feathers and turquoise beads. Running Eagle stood tall and proud in his finest clothing, his love for her visible in every glance, every touch. Little Hawk, dressed in new clothing his grandmother had made, stood between them, his hands holding both of theirs, binding them together as surely as any ceremony could. Stone Shield performed the ritual, speaking of two peoples coming together, of love transcending boundaries, of hope for a future where understanding might replace conflict. The camp gathered to witness this unprecedented union, some still skeptical, but many moved by the obvious devotion between the couple and the happiness radiating from Little Hawk. When Running Eagle and Rebecca exchanged their vows, promising to love and protect each other and the boy who had brought them together, there were few dry eyes among the witnesses. The celebration that followed lasted long into the night, with feasting and dancing and songs in both Comanche and English. Rebecca sang for the assembled tribe, her voice stronger and more confident than it had been on that first night of her captivity, and Running Eagle watched her with such pride and love that Gray Dove laughed and told him he looked like a young man experiencing his first romance. Little Hawk danced with the other children, his blindness no barrier to his joy, his laughter ringing across the camp like music. As the celebration wound down and people began returning to their lodges, Running Eagle led Rebecca to their home, where Gray Dove had already put Little Hawk to bed. The old woman smiled at the newlyweds, patting Rebecca's cheek with genuine affection, before retiring to her own space within the lodge. Finally alone, Running Eagle and Rebecca sat by the fire, hands intertwined, looking at each other with wonder at the journey that had brought them to this moment. Running Eagle spoke softly, telling Rebecca in his improving English that he had never imagined loving again after Morningstar's death, that he had believed his heart was closed forever. but she had opened it with her courage, her kindness, her love for his son, and now he could not imagine life without her. Rebecca responded that she had been so lost, so frightened when the Comanche had captured her, but that captivity had paradoxically set her free, bringing her to a love deeper and truer than any she had known in her old life. They held each other as the fire burned low, two people from different worlds who had found common ground in the most unexpected circumstances. Outside, the winter wind sang through the canyon, but inside the lodge there was only warmth and peace, and the promise of a future built on love and understanding. Little Hawk stirred in his sleep, and Rebecca rose to check on him, tucking the furs more securely around his small body. Running Eagle joined her, and together they stood watching the child sleep, their hands linked, their hearts united. In the years that would follow, Rebecca and Running Eagle would face many challenges as the conflict between the Comanche and white settlers intensified. But they would face those challenges together, their love providing strength and hope in dark times. They would have more children, brothers and sisters for Little Hawk, and raise them to understand both worlds, to carry forward the best of both cultures. Rebecca would become a bridge between peoples, using her position to advocate for peace and understanding, while never forgetting the white woman she had been, or the Comanche woman she had become. But on that wedding night, as Rebecca settled into Running Eagle's arms, as Little Hawk slept peacefully nearby, and as Gray Dove hummed an old Comanche lullaby from her corner of the lodge, the future seemed bright with possibility. Love had conquered fear, understanding had replaced hatred, and a blind boy's joy in a white woman's singing had sparked a transformation that would echo through generations. What Running Eagle had done when he caught Rebecca singing to his son by firelight had indeed shocked the camp, but it had also proven that even in the harshest circumstances, the human heart could choose compassion over cruelty, love over hatred, and hope over despair. And in that choice lay the seeds of redemption for all of them.